Okay, today I am in a beautiful farmhouse studio meeting with our guest. Our guest is Ashley Bellouin, a co-worker of mine at Cycling, but also really a pretty amazing artist in her own right. I'm here on in their farmstead studio having an interview because I happen to be in town talking to her anyway, and so it was a good opportunity to get caught up and to get a podcast interview out of her. So with that, we'll say hello to Ashley. Hey, Ashley, how's it going?
Hi, Darwin. Doing good.
Thank you so much for taking the time to have this chat. Why don't we start off by having you describe your musical work, your artistic work?
Yeah, that's always a hard question for me. People ask me what type of music I make, and I always get silent because I don't really know how to describe it. So I end up saying some things that I don't think make any sense to the person. But I'll try now. So I do focus on music, and I tend to, in the past, I've made some acoustic instruments. Like you can see over in the barn, that thing that looks like a coffin is actually a glass harmonica in there. That was made out of just wine glasses that I strung onto a pole. And I get really obsessed with certain acoustic sounds and want to dig in and basically dissect them. So the other instruments that I built with my partner, Ben Bracken, are those stringed instruments over there that are like about 5 feet long and 36 strings on each instrument. And they're all tuned to the same note. So that ends up creating all these overtones when you play them.
Interesting.
So I tend to approach making music as I get obsessed with one instrument, and then I try to see how much I can get out of that instrument. Like my first solo album I put out was mainly focused on harmonium, and I noticed that our harmonium that we have is not properly tuned. So if you play one note, you hear beating patterns because there's 2 reeds per note. And it's not perfect, but I ended up hearing those rhythms and getting obsessed with them. And then I tend to always use the Mac software and dissecting the sound, kind of like pulling it apart and picking the little elements that I like and then re-putting them back together.
That's really interesting. Now, so first of all, I didn't realize that was a glass harmonica, a concept which doesn't even make sense to me. I ought to make you, later on, I will make you show it to me, but can you describe what a glass harmonica actually is?
Yeah, it was an instrument invented by Benjamin Franklin. That's a string of glass.
Before or after he was electrocuted?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a string of, well, when he first did it, it was, I think, basically maybe the equivalent of wine glasses, just put on a pole. So that's basically what I did. But they got more and more refined to be these crystal bowls that were all strung on a pole. And then you rotate it with a crank and you put your fingers in some water and put them on the glasses. And it's just like rubbing the rim of a wine glass.
Oh, so the wine glasses are like radial along the axis.
And then you can
interesting.
Play many glasses with one hand.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That seems insane because it's a rather unwieldy instrument, given that it looks like it would take kind of a hearse in order to get it from gig to gig. Yeah.
One of the reasons why I haven't played shows, like toured very extensively, is because all the instruments that we make can't travel. So it kind of stuck to anywhere I could drive to.
Right. And these are called again?
We call them monochord tamburas, because one element I forgot to say is that about 10 of the strings are on a tambura bridge, which is a bridge on an Indian instrument. So which
is kind of flattened, so you're going to get kind of a buzzy tone.
Yeah, they get really buzzy sounding.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so that also adds to all the overtones that thing produces.
Interesting, but it's huge. And which makes me, and one of the things I noticed that you don't have here in your studio is like a full-on woodwork shop or something.
Oh, no.
So you seem to be like, on one hand, obsessed with building instruments, but I don't actually see the tools for building instruments here.
No.
How's that happen?
We've kind of cobbled together. Well, the glass harmonica I built when I was in grad school, and there was a grad school at Mills College, and there was an amazing instrument building teacher there. And
name of?
Daniel Schmidt.
Oh, okay.
And he also makes beautiful gamelan music. And he taught me like the basics of instrument building. So I built that at school. And then after that, he let me use his other workshop in Oakland. And that's where those other instruments were built. So it's just kind of like,
right, so you're not
using
building
other
all the
people's
time.
stuff.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
Right. That maybe makes a little bit more sense. It's really cool. So now, I actually had a chance to hear the one release. I'm trying to remember the name of it now. Help me out.
Ballads?
Ballads,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So what instrumentation were you using for that?
That was what I was talking about. That was mainly based on harmonium.
Okay. Right. Because I was going to say, it didn't sound like what you're telling me either of these instruments are about. So.
The glass harmonica is on one track,
okay.
one of the tracks, but it's mainly harmonium and electric guitar. And these other, you can see them right over there. They're these metal poles that are like 3/8 inch diameter. And range from 3 feet long to like 5 feet long or 6 feet long. And they're just aluminum poles. You can get them at the hardware store.
And the point of them is?
If you put rosin on your fingers and run them on the pole, it creates this really high pitch, like angelic sound.
Oh, really?
So those are used on the tracks too.
Okay, well, all of these instruments, though, they actually do kind of point to one thing that I also heard on the album, which is your stuff is not short form by any stretch of the imagination. But it's also, to me, it didn't really come across as like droney, because it seems like you have change going on all the time, and that is part of the passion of how you make the music, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the tracks I've made, I tend to look at them as journeys or stories that are unfolding. Mm-hmm. And to me, that equals a lot of change constantly happening. And that also equals being long form, because I look at it as you start one place, you end somewhere totally different.
Sure.
You can do that in short form, but I'm just a slow person in general. It takes me a while to get things done. So that equals that my tracks end up being really long.
Okay. Interesting. Well, so I'm curious, looking at this variety of instrumentation. One of the things I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about where they came from. And this is kind of a peculiar pursuit, especially when you combine it with using Macs to sort of like pull bits and pieces together. I'm curious about your background and how you got to be the artist that you are, because it seems like, I mean, on one hand, it kind of sounds like following your obsessions into its obvious place, but also these are very much non-traditional. This is non-traditional instrumentation. So it's not like you just like stop listening to Kissin' Foreigner one day and start picking up the glass harmonica. So I'm kind of curious about where you're coming from.
Yeah.
That puts you in a position where your soul hears this stuff, right?
I was in band growing up, and I always played, traditional instruments. But I always moved around between instruments. I couldn't find one that I really liked. Mm-hmm. So like I played oboe. I liked that, but then I was told I couldn't play it because I went into marching band. And so then they put me on percussion, which was like totally different. I had to learn how to play percussion. And then I didn't really like that. And then I switched to piano. So I was always constantly jumping around. And then I realized I didn't have to be in band. I thought band was an obligation. When I realized I didn't have to be in it, I stopped being in band and took art classes instead.
Okay.
It was around early high school times that I always had some older friends that gave me a lot of good music. So I became like interested in, for a high school student in the suburbs, weird music.
Like what?
Like an early drum teacher I had gave me a Can record.
Oh, okay.
And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And so I've always been interested in digging into the more obscure music. Not that I don't know if I consider can obscure anymore. So then I got more into art and went to art school, mainly focused on video and like video art history. And I became an art history major, which was amazing. I just loved learning about the history of video art. I had a few interests. It was the history of video art, and then Islamic architecture. Sounds very different, but there's a lot of patterns that are the same in them. But a lot of these mathematical patterns that emerge. I was also very math oriented in high school. It was my favorite subject.
Okay.
So that's what I focused on then. And then when I was getting my undergrad degree in art history, I had to take some electives and I didn't know what to take. So I saw in the music program, there was a electronic music course. I was like, sure, I'll take that. I have no idea what it is. Introduction to electronic music. And I finished my undergrad at Mills. I had my last year there. I jumped around schools. That's a theme in my life, jump around. And I finished at Mills and I took this intro class, and it was with Maggie Payne, and it was all on the Moog synthesizer. And the entire class was just learning a different part of that synth every week until you know the whole synth, and then you make a piece of music with it. And that's how I learned about signal processing and just like signal flow in general. And it was such a great way for me personally to learn, because it was very physical.
Right.
Like I can say, oh, I have an oscillator, and then I put it into a filter. That makes sense because I can physically route that.
Sure.
And then after that, I was like, oh, this was fun. Maybe my next elective I have to take, I'll take another music class. So I took an intro to computer music. Had no idea what it would be. Turned out it was a Max class. The entire class was Max, and that was by John Bischoff. And I just got hooked. I think that learning on the Moog then made me understand exactly how to patch things in Max. It was this other physicality. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it took me a while to learn Max, but I already had this like used to using patch chords. And then I graduated undergrad, and those two music teachers really kept in touch with me and encouraged me to apply to grad school. So I ended up applying back to Mills for music grad school.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And then went down a deep hole there.
So you actually you then studied music for your graduate degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the electronic music program.
So one of the things I would say, the things that you just showed me of the instruments, there's not a friggin' electron to be found near those things. But I would also say they don't sound like typical acoustic instruments either. So it almost seems like are these sounds that maybe like you heard in electronic world that you wanted to try and find a physical way of manifesting, or? Yeah,
I think that my experience at Mills made me realize that I don't have to play one of these classical instruments that I kept not being committed to growing up. Mm-hmm. That I could make my own sounds, and that making weird sounds I found more fulfilling and engaging to me, which first started on that Moog. And then I think at one point in my graduate studies, because I went in only using electronics, mm-hmm. At some point in those studies, I got dissatisfied with the lack of constant changes in the sounds I was making. Mm. And, I could program a Max patch to be constantly randomizing, making crazy sounds. It takes a lot of work. I could just play the harmonium. Right, and there's already all that variation
all
going
that
on.
Change happens.
Yeah. Right. So I got obsessed with, non-traditional acoustic instruments that already have these really rich overtones. Mm-hmm. And then all I have to do with electronics is like heighten the parts that I like.
Right. So I know that you have taken these instruments out and done some performances. Mm-hmm. First of all, what does it actually take to do it? Probably job one is it has to be a local gig, right?
Yeah, I've done a little like West Coast tour, but that was, driving in my Subaru. So
Right. Okay.
part of the car choice was if the instruments would fit in there.
Nice. You had to. That had to be a great day at the auto dealership. As someone shows up with their what looks like a casket and says, "Hey, can I put this in the back?" But when you perform, then do you actually perform with a computer and with Max running as well?
Yeah, it's always with Max running. So like when I did shows for that album, for the Ballads album, I would play harmonium, and I had a patch that would process the harmonium.
Oh, okay.
And Ben would join me on electric guitar. And if that was like a pared down version of it. If it was local and I could get more people, then I would have someone playing the glass harmonica too.
Interesting. How hard is it to learn to play it?
Oh, it's so easy.
Really?
If you can make a sound on a wine glass, you could play that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So one of the things I think is kind of curious is that your approach to working with modular stuff is probably kind of backwards to what most people now do. I mean, in that you started with these physical devices with the Moog system and physical patch cords and all that stuff, and you moved into Max, where a lot of people right now are sort of like building off of the excitement and fun that they get in different modular systems, whether it's Max or other things, and now are excitingly running over to Eurorack and other modular gear. What, from your perspective, was the advantage of having the Moog first, other than just like the physical connectivity of it? How did it affect you, sort of like cognitively, but how you thought about the design of sound?
Well, it made me think about sound as modular, and like I can start with this, and I could put it through a filter, and then that happens. I think I compartmentalize processes now. Which I think helped me with Max, being able to think of everything as just separate objects that then you put together.
Right.
I think the Moog really drew me in because just that tone, like that's such a soothing, seductive tone if it was, there was the very first Buchla machine in that studio too, which now I maybe prefer the Buchla, but to get started, if that was my first, and that just sounds like crazy, harsh sounds, unless you know what you're doing, right. It might not have captured me as much at the beginning.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. My first modern modular was a Moog format thing, and there's also something about the size of it that is very inviting. It doesn't, because everything's kind of big and not that complicated, it seems to invite plugging in those first couple of patch cables somehow.
It's really hard to make something sound bad, I think.
Yeah, that's true. It's really true. Now, one of the interesting things I know from your background is that your engagement with modular and electronic music stuff isn't solely on an artistic level, but you've kind of built a career hanging out with people doing modular stuff as well too, right?
Yeah. After I graduated Mills, shortly after, I got a job working for Buchla, and that was amazing. It was just basically working with Don in his basement for a year. And there was he had this Victorian house in Berkeley that was the studio, the workshop. And there was an upstairs where one person regularly worked, a few other people came in and out of all the time. And that was like the building everything section. And then downstairs in the basement is where he hung out and just like did some research. And I got hired through a friend of mine now. We didn't know each other at the time. But then Dawn was quickly like, oh, maybe she can help me with all my stuff I want help with too. And then it just turned into, it was the most random job ever. It was like some days would be, write the manual for this new instrument. And the next day would be, help me find an apartment for my son-in-law. And the next day he would call me to come in, and I'd come in, and he had completely forgot what I was supposed to do. So he was like, let's just go get a bagel. Oh, and then, yeah.
Sounds like a kind of fun job.
It was really fun.
What time frame was this? This was like the 200E time frame?
What year was it? It was 2012 or 2013.
Sure.
Maybe it was 2013. It was currently when they're remaking the easel. Oh. Yeah.
Do you feel free talking about that, or would you rather avoid this subject?
Oh, remaking it?
Well, just his feelings about it, because there seems to be some wondering how pleased he was to re-engage with that.
Yeah, I think he always, I think in life, always just wanted to do the next thing. Never wanted to look back. And so being told to reissue that easel, even if he loved the instrument, he was didn't like having to redo something from the past.
That was the wrong direction for him.
Yeah. He also doesn't like being told what to do.
Well, there's that. Well, I get that. Now, another person that then you had an opportunity to work with is Dave Smith.
Yeah. After working with Don, I went to work at Dave Smith. I think I continued to do some stuff for Don on the side, like whenever I had some time. And then at Dave Smith, I was a technical support role, but it also involved repairing the instruments that got shipped back.
Interesting. So, and now you end up at cycling, which really is kind of like, I mean, for a certain kind of person, it's like you're kind of living the dream, because you're getting a chance to be involved in these companies and involved with the development of instruments, or in the case of cycling, tooling that is how people make their artistic dreams come true. I'm always curious, and I'm always curious about people who find themselves in the industry in some way or another, how you find that affects your getting your own work and your own art done. I mean, after a long day of looking at max patches, how into looking at max patches are you for your own work, right? Or,
right.
You know, when you were working with Don, and if you had a long day of writing a manual, do you find that stuff affecting your own artistry?
Definitely. I don't think it affects me wanting to work on music, but it affects how I work on it. So I think when I was at Mills, it was like so much doing electronics that I was like, I'm going to rebel and do some acoustic instruments.
Oh, sure. Right.
And, you know, my own personal rebellion. And then now working at cycling, I find when I go into the studio, all I want to do is use the acoustic instruments instead of writing max patches.
Right.
But I still use Max, but I maybe don't get as tweaky with it as I used to.
Sure. Now, here's a reveal. We went out to lunch and talked about music. What a surprise. When we were out at lunch, you actually talked about having looked at hurdy-gurdies as well, which is yet another opportunity. It seems like strings and or rotation is really a big part of what you're into. Yeah, I think that's pretty awesome. So tell me a little bit more about the fascination with the hurdy-gurdy.
Again, it's just started with the sound of it. I also really love bagpipes, but I'm not good at using my breath anymore. Like when you get out of that, like when I stopped playing oboe, it's like all of a sudden I don't have lungs anymore.
Oh, right.
So I can't really do anything with breath. And to me, the hurdy-gurdy has like somewhat of at least a similar visceral response, where it might sound a little harsh at first, and then you kind of ease into it and realize how lovely the sound is. And it's also can easily be a drone instrument if you just keep it going, or you can do a rhythm with it.
Right. Well, and it also is like really peculiar mechanically as well, which is, if anything, that's another through line among all of your instruments, is kind of like a peculiar physicality to it, right?
Definitely. One thing that I realize that I gravitate towards, and it might be because I've never really mastered an instrument, like I just always switched to the next instrument before I really knew what I was using, is that I tend to make things or only want to play things that are very easy to play.
Oh, right. Okay.
I'm not saying the hurdy-gurdy is. I think that's the opposite. But I think it can be. You can just play a few strings. But I tend to approach pieces, and especially if I want other people to play with me, I want it to be very basic, almost like this folk mentality that anyone could come up and play it. It just, the challenging thing I find with getting people to play with me is just this level of attention. So the instrument can be really easy to play, but you have to have a long attention span and be focused on subtleties. And that actually can be super challenging to get people to go there.
The instruments you have, they might be easy to get a credible tone out of, but also that even when you play it in its most basic way, it's kind of a complex tone too, right? And so kind of what you're inviting people to do in that instance is almost like surprise themselves with complexity they didn't know they were going to be experiencing, right?
Right. And when I have like a guitarist play with me, or I had a cello player on the album too, it's a skill to play very minimally. And I didn't realize, because I don't play those instruments, how challenging it is until I had to ask people to play it and realize that it's extremely hard, especially on cello, to like play one note, but don't hear your bow. You know, like try to make it as consistent as possible.
Right.
And the same with guitar, playing with EBow on the guitar. And I asked, my instructions were, try to match the tones you're hearing from everything else, but then slide off very subtly until you get a beating pattern with the rest of the sound. And that was also challenging for some people because it requires this like high level of attention and very, very subtle moving of your fingers.
Well, and kind of like defeating what some of the instrument is prone to do with, you know, like with a guitar, because it's a fretted instrument. I mean, it's like there aren't really in-between tones, or you have to work really hard to get an in-between tone, right? Mm-hmm. That's cool. So did you end up getting a hurdy-gurdy?
No, not yet. They're expensive, but it's still on my wish list.
Have you been shopping around?
I have. And if I were to buy one, it would be from this couple that builds hurdy-gurdies in Oregon. If I'm remembering, I have it bookmarked. If I'm remembering the name right, it's Alta Wind.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. I remember now where I actually, at first when we were talking about the hurdy-gurdy, I was like, I think I ran into it like in a Norton's Encyclopedia of Music Instruments or something. But then I realized my son ran across like some wacky YouTube video, which was like a guy explaining how ridiculous the hurdy-gurdy is. And so now I actually can remember what it sounds like and stuff like that. But also it's simultaneously a beautiful instrument, but it looks like some kind of weird sewing contraption
That's
too.
True.
So it's like it's kind of, it seems like yet another hard to gig with machine. But also I wonder why is it that a person that, because it's extremely complicated. I mean, there's strings and spinning wheels and cranks and resonators and all this stuff. And I remember looking at that and I'm wondering, why is it that someone that could build this wouldn't just start making guitars or banjos or something that would be a whole lot easier to produce, right?
Yeah. I think it's a special type of person that's just obsessed with this Renaissance instrument. I love people like that get so obsessed with like one obscure thing and devote their life to it.
Yeah.
Those are really interesting people that are worth talking to.
Well, that one might belie your love of bagpipes too, because that seems to be the bagpiper story as well. Very interesting. So one of the things, I don't get that often a chance to talk to people who went through the Mills college experience, but I'm always fascinated when I do, because inevitably when I match up the people I know that were involved and went through the Mills program and how they approach art in general, I'm always really, I find that artwork compelling. I find it really interesting, both intellectually as well as like the result of the output. What is it about Mills that has sort of like, the magic elixir that at least the way I view things is able to really develop interesting artists out of their student body?
Well, for me personally, I didn't have a music undergrad, and a lot of schools wouldn't accept me because I didn't have that.
Oh, okay.
Mills will. They'll accept any background. So I think you get a lot of different types of people because you don't necessarily had to have studied art or music. As long as you had some compelling portfolio and showed interest, they would consider you. So, like, I know people that were even more off topic than I seem to be, but because that got into the program and were amazing. Because music might have been always on the side for them. They didn't study it formally.
Right.
And I think a lot of higher education is still really focused on this formal education, needing a background in that.
At this point, we don't, in the US, if you're 18 years old, you don't get to smoke, you don't get to drink, but you have to decide what your career is going to be for the rest of your life when you go to college. And you sound like a person who kind of like bopped around a couple of different places finding your landing spot. And probably in the end, if you would have talked to a career counselor, they would have said video art history and then moving on to a graduate degree in music. Yeah, not so much, right?
Yeah. To me, it doesn't seem that weird, but a lot of people think it is weird. To me, it's just another art form,
right?
And I can apply the stuff I knew in art history to making music.
Sure, or even as you stated, like the Islamic architecture because of the patterning and stuff. I mean, there are definitely parallels to certain kinds of musical description as well, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think Mills really encourages that cross-disciplinary, and that's why it attracts certain types of people.
Right. What are the things that you learned that you still find yourself using all the time?
That I learned at Mills?
Yeah.
Well, besides the obvious Macs. I learned so much from that instrument building course with Daniel, just about the mechanics of an instrument and like looking at it like a piece of architecture. And maybe because I don't know any acoustic instrument very well, like knowing maybe how to approach instruments better if you understand the construction of them.
Like what's an example?
So I have these instruments on the wall over here that are called keens. They're from Laos. Mm-hmm. They're a wind instrument that have little metal reeds inside.
Okay. And
before I might not have really even cared to think about how that was made. But after that course, now I think about like, what kind of reed would be inside? And is it a double reed? Is it a single reed? How can I manipulate that to get the tone that I want?
That's pretty fascinating because I look at that and absolutely none of the things that you mentioned came to mind. So that's really cool. Have you been imagining any new instruments yet lately?
Well, I've been really into using those long stringed instruments over there with dulcimer hammers.
Oh.
And doing this like very repetitive rhythmic stuff. Mm-hmm. But obviously, like we talked about, those can't really travel very well.
Right.
So I've been just recently getting into the idea of maybe actually purchasing an instrument, purchasing a zither.
Oh, okay.
Because that's smaller form. I could have more than one note. And I could continue doing these rhythmic things just in a higher pitch.
Right. Now, the one thing is, though, like working with the zither that's going to require at least more than minimal facility, because it's not, to get a good tone out of that isn't necessarily a simple task. Maybe not as easy as some of these other tools.
Yeah. I have some other things on my wish list, like a pump organ. If I was going to build something again, I'd want it to be really small.
Yeah, right.
Something that can just fit in your backpack. But I don't know what that would be yet.
Well, I know. Now you have my head twisted. I'm looking at those wind instruments, and you said that you don't have lungs anymore. I'm like, what kind of a blower could you construct that would actually blow that for you? That might be kind of an interesting thing, right?
I know. I've tried to play them. They kind of get really lightheaded when I play them.
Yeah, well, I actually saw something similar when I saw a bamboo orchestra one time, and they have a similar kind of thing where you like hold it like this, and it's got tubes going all different directions.
Yeah.
And it was, the guy looked like he was running a marathon. It looked like a lot of work to activate the air in that thing.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about some of the details about how you actually integrate this stuff then into electronics, because what I would say that what you've done, the name of the podcast is Art, Music, and Technology, and what's interesting to me is that this is like a completely different take on technology than most people provide in our interviews. For most people, the technology is either circuit boards or software, right? And in your case, it's literal hardware constructions that have a musical result. But the fact is that you are also enhancing them through the use of electronics and max patches and stuff. It strikes me that these are instruments that would be kind of hard to hybridize. It would be hard to get a good quality tone out of it into a computer, especially in a performative situation, because these are big boxes. They're going to be big resonant cavities, and if you put stuff through a PA, you're talking about feedback central, right?
Yeah. So how do I do that?
Yeah, so how do you do that? Exactly.
The type of long form music I make doesn't really necessarily need a live mic on it. So by that, I mean, like with the harmonium, I could just have the acoustic sound of the harmonium in the room. And the mic can be picking it up and putting the sound in my computer and processing it and bringing it back out. So that,
and you never have to have the original tone.
Yeah, I don't necessarily need the original.
Of course.
The original can just be acoustic. And I mean, that's not ideal. I would rather put it through speakers, but it's better than doing it with the feedback issue.
Now, at one point, didn't you do some sort of performance in a cave or a cavern or a...
I think you're thinking about, there's these old military bunkers.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Wasn't it in San Francisco?
It's in right across from San Francisco in the Marin Headlands.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How do you get access to that, first of all?
That was a part of a festival called Soundwave, and they're still going. They do site-specific music and art shows that are in very unique locations. So that was one of them.
Truly.
Yeah.
Well, because it was interesting because, first of all, the pictures of it looked kind of like simultaneously amazing and a little bit creepy.
It was very cold too.
Oh yeah. Oh, yeah. But also, again, thinking about like that being a locale where you would have had to like pump the instrument in, but also find a place. Because when I would assume in something like that, the positioning of the instrument in the space was probably critical to making it sound great.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought that one show up because those stringed instruments were actually made for that show.
Oh, okay.
And then they just turned into their own life after that.
Oh, that's interesting.
But I did that show with Ben, and that was our idea for making those instruments was because that tunnel is very resonant. And we thought if we make something stringed instruments that have a lot of overtones, and those overtones might like float around the space.
Right.
And so we played in the center of the tunnel, and I can't remember how long it is, but it's a really long tunnel. We played in the center, and specifically very repetitive on those instruments, so that all the overtones just end up filling the space.
Build up.
Yeah.
I know a couple of people who actually were able to attend, and And the consensus was that that the sound was jaw dropping, that it was unbelievable, and it was a little freakish the way it would change as you moved around, again because of the way the overtones were interacting with the space around it. Sounds fascinating to me.
It was all concrete too, so things were bouncing off the walls everywhere.
Yeah. Super heavy duty. Well, actually, our time is just about up, but before we go, I do want to learn what's next. I love your releases, but you don't do a lot of them.
No. Like I said, I'm slow.
Well, right, apparently. But can you turn the tape recorder on? Because I really find the music compelling, and I'm just wondering if you have any imaginations of what the next release might be.
Well, I actually do have one coming up.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a collaboration with Ben that we have a duo that I think our very first show we did was that tunnel one that you just mentioned. And since then, we've kind of off and on been making pieces together. And this album that we finish is going to come out in January.
Oh, that's fantastic. Who's putting it out?
Drawing Room Records, who put out ballads too.
Right.
It's 3 pieces, so a little bit more than last time.
Wow, it's like pop tunes.
Yeah. And they all are focused on those string instruments.
The monochords.
Yeah, the monochords, and each piece focuses on playing them in a different way. So one is with ebows, the next one is strumming them, and then the next one is putting fishing line through them and bowing them. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Oh, that's incredible. That is so interesting. Well, I'll be looking forward to hearing that. That'll be fantastic. And I want to thank you for taking the time to have this chat. It's really great it's great to do it in this space, to be able to kind of point at the instruments as we talk about them. It's fascinating. As soon as we turn this off, I'm going to have you crack open the coffin so I can see this glass harmonica. I'm dying to do it. And for people who want to learn more about your work, where's a good place to send them?
I have a website that's just my name, ashleybellouin.com.
Ashleybellouin.com.
I should actually update it. So
okay,
yeah.
Please do, and I will put I'll put a thing in the show notes so that people can jump over there and take a look.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Well, many thanks to Ashley for having the great chat. It was really cool to be in their little barn studio and to be surrounded by all these great instruments. It was awesome. And it was really great to learn more about how she comes up with the ideas of the music. If you haven't checked it out yet, go check out that Ballads album. It's really gorgeous. I think you'll really get a sense of where she's coming from in that. I am about to get started on the push towards episode 300. I'm actually this week going to be going on site to have an interview with somebody that's going to be podcast number 300, but there's going to be some other changes, including some funding changes and stuff like that are going to occur. And so I'm kind of looking forward to it. I hope that you are. 300 episodes. Can you believe it? Well, none of it would be possible without you, the listeners. I want to thank you so much for continuing to keep on. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And with that, I will let you have the rest of your week. Catch you next time. Bye.